This is the Day of Battle podcast. I'm your host, Joe Hayes. Welcome back. I've been getting some feedback from you guys out there, and I just want to thank you for subscribing to the podcast and for pushing it out there wherever you have sent it to your friends or family. And the feedback that I've been getting is very positive, and I'm hearing that people are being impacted by this message that I'm bringing. And I just want to say that I feel very encouraged by it. And so thank you. And what I'm going to continue to do is drop an episode once a week, unless something crazy comes up. And I just want to be there as a source of truth, biblical truth, grounded in the Word of God, with a warrior mentality. And I want it to be something that you guys can tap into every week, whether you're on your way to work or you're working the night shift and it's 3:15 in the morning, you got nothing else going on. Hey, check out the Day of Battle podcast. And if you have any questions or comments for the podcast, you can email me at dayofbattlepodcast@gmail.com. We are on YouTube. You can like and subscribe there. We're on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And you obviously know one of those things because you're listening to it right now. So today, let's talk about this. What do I wish I would have known before going into combat in the Marine Corps? There's a lot of things that I wish I would have known. I would have liked to have been more familiar with our area of operation. Me personally, I don't have a great sense of direction when I'm in a new place. Like if I fly across the country and land myself in Dallas, Texas, and you just throw me in an Uber, I'm not going to know which way is north, south, east, or west. That's just me. It's kind of embarrassing from time to time. My wife can give me a really hard time about that because she's usually right on and she has like a compass inside of her brain. And any time that she doesn't have that going on and I do, I make sure that I let her know it because, I got to have that one over her. But when I was in Ramadi, I found myself sometimes wondering exactly where I was. And that's normal. That's going to be common anytime you get into an area where you're unfamiliar with. It takes time to learn the terrain. And when you are trying to learn the terrain and you're trying to defend yourself inside of that area, it becomes even more difficult because the enemy is going to be very familiar with the area of operations, especially if they live there or if they've just been there longer than you have. Something else I wish I would have known that is vital to victory in the mission is the enemy. I wish I would have known the enemy. Going into Ramadi, we really weren't exactly sure who we were going to be up against. Whether they were Ba'athist Party loyalists to Saddam Hussein, whether they were immigrating from other portions of the Middle East, which they were, coming over from Syria, possibly some forces in Iraq coming in from Iran. You have Sunnis in the Sunni Triangle. You have Shiites in the surrounding areas. And we were not very well versed in exactly who they were. And if you think about it, not knowing or not understanding your enemy and who he is, how he trains, how he fights and attacks, what he does when he is attacked, what he does when he is not in direct combat or conflict with you, how he behaves, where he sleeps, what he eats, how he trains, what he shoots, what he carries, what he wears, what makes him comfortable, what makes him uncomfortable. Knowing all those things about your enemy is vital to your success in battle. And if you look throughout history, you can see that those who did not know their enemy failed. You look at a situation with Neville Chamberlain negotiating with Adolf Hitler, and you only have history to look at to see that it was a disaster. And that comes from personal weakness and many other things, but he did not understand his enemy. If you go back to the Revolutionary War, where we were fighting against the British, we knew our enemy in that war. We knew exactly what they were going to do, and we decided to maneuver on them in ways that they had never seen. And the error that the British made was they didn't know their enemy. and our guys are now hiding in trees and pushing guerrilla warfare tactics upon them. And we won that war against all odds, but it was because they did not know their enemy, but we did. If you think about knowing your enemy and you put that in context of the current negotiations with the Iranian regime, the Iranians are after nuclear weapons. They subscribe to a Shiite eschatology, meaning a Shiite Muslim view of end times things. And if you understand those things, you know that they're waiting for the Mahdi to come. And once the Mahdi comes, who is this great spiritual leader, he will usher in a time of doom for Christians and for Israel. And the Muslims will all rise up together, and they'll take over the world, and they will kill all the Christians and all the Jews. And it's this apocalyptic viewpoint that they have. And the Ayatollah Khomeini has it. The leader of Iran has it. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps has this same view. And so when you understand that your enemy believes that, and then they're after nuclear weapons, well, why do you think they want nuclear weapons? Because they want to use them to usher in this apocalyptic era. So understanding that, realize that while you're negotiating with them. And when they're just trying to kick the can down the road and eventually gain nuclear weapons legally, you should probably understand that that's not going to be very good for your health in the long run. So that's a situation where knowing your enemy is vitally important to the success of your mission and the sustainment of your life. So back to me when I was in Iraq, I wish that I would have understood who my enemy was. My enemy was someone that was eventually going to morph into the current version of ISIS. I should have understood, or I would have liked to have known, that they weren't just going to hit us in a little tiny small cell of guys and then withdraw and flee from us. Because that's not what they did. They hit us. They reinforced themselves. Their goal was to isolate a small unit like we were, 10, 12, 14 men out there in the city. They wanted to lock us down, cut off our support, drain our ammo, kill or wound as many as they could. While delaying anyone coming to our aid, they could finish us off. And it didn't matter if any of them died in the process of it, because they were there for jihad, and they were there for the eternal purpose of it all, so that they could have that eternity in the afterlife. They could have their 72 virgins, and they just really didn't care if they died. In fact, they actually hoped for death in battle. They weren't scared of dying. And the understanding that I had of that as a 21-year-old Marine was just nothing compared to the understanding that I have now. And I know hindsight is always 20/20, but I just can't help but wish I would have known more and understood my enemy more. When it comes to knowing who your enemy is, I'm not the first person that said that you should do that. Maybe the first person that's told us the importance of knowing our enemy is Sun Tzu. Now, who was Sun Tzu? He was a great Chinese military strategist, and his sayings and his philosophies about war have been compiled into a book called The Art of War. He was around in the 5th century BC. Again, Chinese military strategist. And I think it'd be important and probably valuable for people to pay attention to someone like this, considering that the country of China definitely employs the teachings of Sun Tzu. And if you look at their trajectory, they're going straight up and they're going for world domination. And if we understood them and we understood their methodologies and their ideologies, we would do ourselves a big favor as the great United States of America. Drawing back from that, though, one of his most famous quotes is this: "If you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles." This is a profound statement, that if you know the enemy and you know yourself, so you have to know both. You have to understand your enemy's strengths, his weaknesses. You have to know where he sleeps, where he eats, how long he sleeps for, what he shoots, who supplies him, the routes that he takes. You got to know who his girlfriend is. You got to know who he has kids with. You got to know everything about your enemy. And if you know that, and then you know yourself, and you know your strengths and weaknesses, and you know how to fix your weapon so that if it ever jams, you can clear that jam and get your weapon functioning quickly. And you just know everything about yourself, and you mitigate all these little tiny issues so that you can prepare yourself to face your enemy. And when you know all of those things, he says, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. The battle is already won when you know yourself and you know your enemy. And that's provided you have the discipline to make the right moves with the knowledge that you have of yourself and your enemy. If you would put this in the terms of UFC, and you've got Conor McGregor fighting Dustin Poirier for the 4th time. Okay, I'm going to buy that fight when it comes out. But if Conor McGregor knows Dustin Poirier as he knows himself, then he will have made all of the adjustments that he needs to make before that fight. And if he knows Dustin Poirier as he knows himself, he will know what Dustin Poirier will tweak in order to prepare for Conor McGregor the 4th time. The fight is going to come down to who knows the enemy as they know themselves and who knows those things better. It's always going to come down to that. Now, every now and then you get lucky, right? Every now and then Conor McGregor steps back and rolls his ankle, which happened in the last fight. It was so devastating to see because that fight was getting pretty good. I'm sure everybody has their own opinion about it. Maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. I personally enjoy watching the UFC. It just brings something out inside of my chest, and I love it. And anyways, back to know your enemy and know yourself. If you do, you don't have to fear the results of your battles. So going back into Ramadi, if I knew my enemy as I knew myself, I would have carried a lot more ammo. I would have never separated from my squad like I did that day. And maybe you're saying to me, Joe, you don't need to have these regrets. You don't need to wish you could have done it a different way. I know that. I accept the outcome of that day. And if you haven't listened to that episode, I encourage you to go back and listen to the Battle of Ramadi. It was my 3rd episode that I released. And it's where I really tell the story of what happened to me over in Iraq back in 2004 and just some life-changing events that happened in my life. But so there's a lot of things that I would have done differently based off of my knowledge of how the enemy is going to operate. And, I know that I'm not alone in that thinking because, well, if my platoon sergeant and if my company commander and if the battalion commander and the 1st Marine Division general, if all of those people would have known the enemy exactly as they know themselves, they would have not made certain decisions that they made either. So it's not just me, it's everybody across the board. That's why we learn from our mistakes. And some of those mistakes really boil down to the fact that you didn't know the enemy as you know yourself. And everybody knows themselves pretty good as long as they're honest with themselves. And as long as they have that discipline where when they do know themselves, they'll make the required adjustments to push on for victory and not just succumb to failure out of lack of, caring about that outcome enough. When I was a police officer, I had a certain leader that I really respected. And this guy, he'd been on for so many years as a police officer, and he was so cautious. We would go to certain calls for service that seemed very mundane at times because there is a repetitive nature to certain calls you can get. And for me, I noticed that at times I would get complacent and I would get sometimes annoyed that I would have to go deal with something that, say like an alarm is going off at some warehouse, and the alarm has gone off 7 times in the last 10 days. And out of those 10 days, I've worked 5 of them, and I'm working nights, and I've had to make multiple trips down to this warehouse to go check this alarm. And of course, if it's going off, we're going to go check on it. But you can become complacent when it's your 5th time checking that alarm in the last week. But I had this one leader, and it didn't matter if it was the 5th time he had to check that alarm that week. He was still going in there prepared. He was still pulling up the way he should, turning off his lights on his patrol car, sneaking up on it, hand on the gun, pieing around corners, because he knew that he did not know for sure if it was real or not. Maybe it was another false alarm, but maybe there was a guy inside, and maybe he was committing a burglary. Maybe he was murdering someone inside and the alarm's going off. We don't know, actually. And this one leader that I had he always inspired me because of the discipline that he had in his life to take everything seriously. And I know that over the years, that mentality that he has had has saved his life. And so, not everybody is going to be like that. And the ones that are, I applaud you, because you realize that there is an enemy out there that you don't know, and you are preparing yourself for him as much as you possibly can. And so you are not going to be caught flat-footed if you realize that sometimes there's nothing you can know about an enemy, but you do everything that you can. You prepare for the known unknowns in those situations. The principle of this, of knowing your enemy as you know yourself, and then you need not fear the result of 100 battles, this really plays into our spiritual lives. And we live and exist in a spiritual battle. There is spiritual conflict and war going on all around us all of the time. And many people ignore that. A lot of people don't want to know that. They'd rather just stick their head in the sand like an ostrich and say, I don't see it, I don't hear it, it doesn't exist. Well, actually it does. And it's going to catch you off guard one of these days. In 1 Peter 5:8, Peter tells us, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. So Peter tells us a lot about our enemy right there. And you can learn about your enemy throughout the Word of God. You can understand that this battle between God and Satan has been going on since really before the creation of the world. It went back to the time where Satan rebelled against God and took a third of the angels from heaven. And they rose up in a horrible war against God because Satan desires worship. And he's extremely prideful and just completely conceited and full of himself. And then his next thing was to take God's creation away from God. And so he went down and he deceives Adam and Eve. He tricks them into sinning against God. And in doing so, they lose their souls over it. They lose life itself. But then God steps in and God covers them. He covers their sins with a sacrifice. He then sets in motion this plan to eventually redeem mankind. And down through the years, you have all of the sacrifices that are made, and they're all pointing to the cross. And then one day Jesus comes, God himself, and he dies upon the cross, and he finishes it for all of mankind. And that was a mighty blow against Satan. But it's still not over yet. Satan is still going to rise up again, and he's going to come against God's people. He's coming for all of us. And even though we're not yet at that final stage where he's coming against all of us with all that he has, he is still doing these things impacting our lives and trying to take us while we're caught off guard. And he wants to kill us. That is his goal. He wants to absolutely destroy you. And so if you are a follower of Christ, you can bet that he's coming for you. And if you're committed to Christ, he's coming for you even harder. And he's not going to stop, and he's not going to give up. He means to take you down and everything with you. If you are a man and you serve God, he is going to come at you the best way that he knows how. And Satan has read Sun Tzu. And Satan knows more than Sun Tzu ever knew about military conflict. And Satan knows the Bible better than you do. And Satan has seen men over the years, over thousands and thousands of years. He has seen how men act and react to things placed in front of them. And he understands what will pull a man away from his family and away from God. And you can probably read between the lines and see what I'm talking about. He knows what he can put in front of you to lead you down the wrong path. Your job is to know your enemy. Peter tells us that he walks around like a lion, looking for who he may devour. He's not coming to scare you. He's not coming to growl at you. He is coming to devour you. He wants to chomp your head in two. He wants to eat everything that you are and make you no more. That's what his goal is. So what do you do with that? Peter says that we have got to be sober and vigilant because our adversary is walking around like that. And he says, resist him, steadfast in the faith. That means that you have got to be pouring into the Word of God every day. Every day is game day. Every day is the day of battle. It doesn't stop. It doesn't stop because it's Saturday or Sunday. It is ongoing. And it can look so many different ways. You know, Satan can attack you 8 ways from Sunday. And sometimes I don't know if I would call it Satan specifically attacking you, or if I would just call it life happening and God allowing certain things in your life. You know, because the types of hardships that we can go through where we're feeling attacked and we have an opportunity to move farther away from God, those opportunities are endless. If you're in financial trouble, well, there's a lot of bad things that you could do to make money. You could decide to go rob a bank. You could decide to go sell drugs. You could decide to go get a job and find yourself in a job where it's a horrible environment and it's going to pull you farther away from God. You could have medical problems or health problems in your life, and those things and the results of those problems and the trauma that comes with it, that could ultimately push you away from God if you let it. Or you could lean into them and go through them with the Lord. It's your choice how you're going to react. Or maybe you get blessed with a lot of wealth, and then on the other side of that, you forget about God. And all of a sudden, you used to be prayerfully considerate of God in all things. And then now that you don't need him anymore because you don't have to depend on him for that paycheck every 2 weeks and you're just so well off, well, you just don't need God that much. And so I would say that not to be too general with it, because that's not true of everybody, of course. We are to resist him and be steadfast in the faith. When I think of resisting and I think of knowing your enemy, my mind immediately goes back to Joseph. When Joseph had been sold into slavery and he's in Egypt, and then he is in front of that woman that tries to seduce him. He didn't want anything to do with her. He didn't tell her no. He didn't tell her back up. He just took off running. Because I think Joseph knew himself as much as he knew his enemy. Maybe he didn't know her that much. Maybe he didn't know that she was going to be coming on to him when he was in that house. Because if he did, he probably wouldn't have ventured inside of there. But Joseph did know himself, and he probably knew that there was going to be a point where he would give in to that temptation. And so what he did was, this dude just took off and got out of that house. And of course, she put a charge on him, and he ended up going to prison for it. You can read about the rest of the story in the book of Genesis. Great story. But that's an example of someone that is resisting and being steadfast in the faith. And at the end it says, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. So the message is this, that you're not alone. Satan's not just coming for you. He's coming for everybody. And if you think that you're the only one having a hard time and that you're being singled out, actually you're wrong. You're not. He's coming for everybody. Yeah, it's not just you. You're not the only one under attack. You're not the only one that's lost something. After I was wounded in Ramadi, I was being medevaced in a Humvee. And this was, I don't know exactly how many hours after I had been wounded. And there was a dose or two of morphine involved after I'd gotten to a hospital. And then I found myself in the back of a Humvee with a bunch of Marines. And there was just a lot of carnage. And I remember that I'm sitting there on the bench in this Humvee, and I'm hurting. And I'm thinking about what I'd just gone through. And I looked about this Humvee, and there's all these other Marines, and some of them just look so young. And these guys are just chewed up. And then I hear this deep voice of this Marine to my left, and he's sitting on a bench. And he's sitting there saying, "It's okay, Marines, cheer up, hoorah." And he's just giving all this encouragement to everybody and saying, you guys fought well, and be proud of yourselves and keep your heads held up high. You're going to be okay. Every one of you is going to make it. You're going to be all right. And I turned and I looked over at this guy, and he was definitely several years older than me. I'd say he's in his mid-30s. And half of his face was completely chewed up by an explosion. And he was missing an eye. And I'd never seen anyone like this before. It was breathtaking to see this man sitting there with half of his face just completely destroyed. It was actually from a rocket-propelled grenade. And he's just sitting there encouraging everybody like such a valiant warrior. I was so impressed with this guy. And at some point in time, I introduced myself to him. And this man's name was Gunnery Sergeant Nick Popadich. He's such an awesome Marine. He ended up staying in the Marine Corps. And I've gotten to talk to him a few times. But I never forgot that experience of seeing him as he is so wounded, a horrific wound. And then just the encouragement coming out of him. And it reminds me, when I read this verse, I'm reminded of him. When it says that knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. Peter's telling us that you're not just on your own. You are going to be under attack. But it's not just you. Everybody else is too. And you've got a brotherhood out there that's going through it with you. And we need to lean on each other. So let's focus on this. You need to know your enemy. And you need to know yourself. And if you're going to do that, then you don't need to fear the result of 100 different battles. The result will be the same if you know that enemy as you know yourself, and you make the required adjustments that you need to make. And that adjustment might just be, I need to get in the Word of God more. I need to get up 20 minutes earlier so I can sit down and meet God every morning. Or maybe it's not at that time. Maybe it's on your lunch hour. Maybe it's another time where you just pull over on the side of the road and say, I'm going to meet with God today. Maybe it's not anything scheduled and it's completely out of the ordinary, and you just say, I'm taking a 10-minute break for me and God. God offers you that relationship. And if you do that, He's going to be with you. God knows your enemy, And God knows you. And He's got this for you. But we've got to be sober. We've got to be vigilant. And to not go meet the Lord on a regular basis means that you don't know your enemy. And you don't know what he's capable of. Because he is coming for you, and he's coming for everything that you've got. He's coming for your family. He's coming for your wife. He's coming for your children. He wants to take you down. He wants you to lose all of that. He wants you to curse God, and he wants you to die. He means business. And the business is for your soul. He is a roaring lion, and he looks at you like a little rabbit. Well, you know what? You're not a rabbit. You're a man. You are a man of God. And you've been beat up, and you've been shot in the gut, and you've lost an eyeball, and you've come out with your battle scars. But you know what? You're not alone, are you? Because you look to your left and you look to your right, and you see other guys that are beat up just like you, but we're still ready to take one for the team. And we're still trusting the Lord. And we're not giving up on each other, and we're not giving up on our walks with God. We're going to wade into the fight, and we're going to kick him in the freaking teeth, right? The Lord goes before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. He has your 12, and he has your 6.